Liberation movements in Africa have strong historical ties with both China and Russia. This is largely the result of these movements' susceptibility to socialism, especially during the Cold War. In case of most of these liberation movements, the ties were stronger with the Soviet Union than with China. In 1979, the African National Congress, later to become the ruling party in South Africa, undertook a Soviet-sponsored study tour to Vietnam to learn about the strategies employed by Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap against the United States during the Vietnam War. These strategies were inspired by what is described as the People's War strategy of Mao Zedong. Two important developments in the second half of the 20th century paved the way for increased Chinese influence in Africa. The first was the process of decolonization, which commenced in the early 1950s and led to the coming to power of many of these revolutionary movements. The second was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the consequent collapse of the Soviet Union. Given the role that the US played in the coming to power of some of these liberation movements, particularly in the case of South Africa, some maintained close ties and trade relations with the US. These movements, however, still pursued Marxism and Leninism and were still opposed to the free market policies of the Western world. Over time, as will become evident in this report, Africa has made a gradual shift away from the US and started turning towards China for political, ideological, and economic leadership. China operates according to a socialist market economy and currently has a population of more than 1.4 billion people, which is more than 18% of the total world population. It reported a tax revenue of $116,597 billion in November 2019. In 2009, China surpassed the US as Africa's biggest trading partner. By 2017, Africa-US trade amounted to $55 billion, while Africa-China trade had already reached $155 billion. China's global development strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative, played an important role in this regard. By September 2009, 40 out of the 54 African countries had signed some sort of an agreement of understanding or other agreement to become part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China's influence in countries like Zambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, and South Africa was expanded exponentially as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative and through major investment in this infrastructure scheme. At the summit with African leaders in Beijing in September 2018, Xi Jinping pledged $60 billion for endeavors in Africa, in addition to China's 2015 promise of $60 billion to be delivered in the forms of investment and loans as a means of bettering the lives of locals and putting more emphasis on the environment and resources. During this time, China also became increasingly involved in US peacekeeping operations in Africa by offering training for military officers and military assistance in a number of African nations. The South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, is one of China's most forceful advocates in Africa, pushing back at the United States on a variety of issues, to the extent that he is comfortable to stand up in Washington, D.C. and endorse key foreign policy objectives of the Chinese government. This creates opportunities for other African leaders to follow suit. Eric Olander illustrates this point by pointing out that Ramaphosa's public statement that the US was clearly jealous of Huawei's advancement in 5G technology was followed just 1 week later by a statement by Joseph Muchero, Kenya's Minister on Information and Communications, in which he pledged Kenya's support for China and Huawei. As of June 2018, Huawei had 14.5% South African market share compared to Apple's 4%. The Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi has visited South Africa so often that his visits are no longer regarded as newsworthy. Eric Olander points out that the lack of media interest in Wang's visits to Africa is partially indicative of how frequent his visits to the continent have become, to the extent that they are now a normalized part of the African political landscape. Speaking at the 2019 BRICS Summit, Ramaphosa praised the great achievement of the Chinese people under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and added that South Africa opposed the bullying tactics, presumably by the United States and other Western countries, against China and the unfair treatment of Chinese enterprises on the international stage. Xi Jinping said that China was ready to develop a comprehensive strategic partnership with Africa.